The story of the Chernobyl disaster, etched permanently into the human consciousness, is often told through the blinding light of the explosion, the relentless grind of the cleanup, and the heartbreaking scale of the resulting evacuation. We speak of the heroes, the firefighters who first arrived, the pilots who dumped sand and lead onto the inferno, and the desperate liquidators. But beneath the mushroom cloud of radioactive debris and political upheaval, there was a relentless, systemic hunt for accountability. The Soviet Union, built on an ethos of central planning and technological infallibility, could not afford to admit systemic failure. Blame had to be localized, personified, and punished. This search for a scapegoat led directly to the control room of reactor number 4, focusing with devastating intensity on the men who were present during the fateful test. And among those men, one figure stood out, both by virtue of his seniority and the uncompromising nature of his command that night: Anatoly Stepanovich Dyatlov. Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer for operations at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, was the supervising authority for the notorious safety test scheduled for the night of April 26, 1986. To understand the weight of the hammer that fell upon him, we must first understand the man and the environment in which he operated. An environment where technical rigidity often superseded common sense, especially under intense operational pressure. If the history of Chernobyl captivates you, if you seek to understand the intricate details of how this catastrophe unfolded and how justice, or the Soviet version of it, was ultimately served, then please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue to delve into these critical historical investigations. Anatoly Dyatlov was far more than just a functionary. He was a nuclear veteran, a demanding taskmaster known for his unyielding adherence to procedure, and a personality often described by his subordinates as abrasive, perhaps even tyrannical. He had come to Chernobyl in 1973, drawn by the promise of the massive RBMK reactor fleet. Before that, he had worked on submarine reactors in Komsomolsk-on-Amur, an experience that forged in him a belief in rigid discipline essential for handling complex, high-energy systems. This background instilled in Dyatlov an iron resolve, one that interpreted any pushback or questioning of orders as insubordination, a trait that proved fatal on the night of the explosion. The specific test Dyatlov was supervising, the turbine rundown test, was designed to determine whether the residual kinetic energy of a spinning turbine could generate enough electricity to power the reactor's critical cooling pumps during the brief period between a power failure and the activation of the emergency diesel generators. It was a standard safety test, one that had failed 3 previous attempts, adding an extra layer of pressure and urgency to the April 25th, 26th attempt. Dyatlov was insistent that this time the test must be completed successfully, a decision driven by operational necessity and perhaps a degree of professional pride and exasperation over previous failures. When the parameters began to spiral out of control in the early hours of April 26th, leading to the reactor's power dropping dangerously lower condition known as xenon poisoning, where the reactor becomes unstable and difficult to control, it was Dyatlov who, against the protests of some of his younger engineers, insisted on continuing the power increase back up to the mandated test level. This instruction, given under extreme time constraints and in violation of several existing operational safety protocols that dictated shutting down the reactor at such low power levels, became the pivot point of the catastrophe. His logic, later explained in his own defense, was that the safety regulations were primarily focused on conventional heat engineering dangers, not necessarily the esoteric physics of reactor core dynamics, and that his actions were aimed at bringing the reactor back to a stable, albeit difficult, operational plateau to proceed with the critical safety evaluation. However, the laws of physics are indifferent to administrative pressure or professional pride. When the emergency shutdown button, AZ5, was finally pressed, the design flaws inherent in the RBMK reactor models, specifically the graphite tips on the control rods that initially displace water and increase reactivity before the boron carbide fully enters the core, caused an instantaneous and catastrophic power spike. The power surge was so massive, so rapid, that it exceeded the scale on the measuring instruments and caused the first explosion, a steam detonation that blew the 1,000-ton upper plate off the reactor vessel. This was immediately followed by a second, far more powerful blast caused by the reaction of steam with superheated graphite, which scattered the highly radioactive core material across the roof and surrounding area, initiating the massive graphite fire that would burn for days. In the immediate, horrific chaos, Dyatlov's training kicked in, but tragically, his initial assessments were fundamentally flawed. Like many others present, he simply could not conceive of a total reactor core breach. Soviet nuclear engineering dogma held that such a scenario was physically impossible. Instead, Dyatlov believed the damage was contained, perhaps a rupture of water channels or a hydrogen explosion in the cooling circuits. He issued frantic, desperate orders to supply water to the core, believing that somehow the reactor could still be cooled and saved. He ordered operators to physically open water valves, forcing men into the areas where radiation levels were already astronomical, sacrificing their lives in a futile attempt to cool a core that no longer existed. Dyatlov himself, heavily exposed to the instant, massive plume of neutron and gamma radiation streaming directly from the open reactor pit, remained near the control room and throughout the station, trying to assess the damage and coordinate the response. The sheer volume of radioactive energy absorbed by his body was instant and overwhelming. Within minutes, the insidious work of the radiation began. The symptoms of acute radiation syndrome are terrifyingly swift in massive doses. Within an hour, Dyatlov started experiencing the classic metallic taste in his mouth, the severe nausea, and the intractable vomiting. His skin began to redden, a deep ominous flush indicating severe cellular damage. Despite his rapidly deteriorating physical state, he continued to function for several crucial hours. He was instrumental in locating the plant director, Viktor Bryakanov, and communicating his deeply flawed, but sincerely held, initial assessment. Reactor number 4 was damaged, but the core was intact, and the situation was controllable. This miscommunication, born of denial and the physical inability to believe in the impossible, traveled up the Soviet chain of command, leading to disastrous delays in recognizing the true scope of the disaster. For hours, Moscow was informed that the reactor was merely suffering from a small explosion and fire, leading to a crucial missed window for immediate, wider evacuation. By dawn, Dyatlov was visibly failing. He was finally convinced by subordinates to leave the plant and seek medical help. His hands and face were severely burned by radiation, and his constant vomiting made walking nearly impossible. He was first taken to the local Pripyat hospital, Hospital number 126, where doctors struggled to understand the nature of the unseen illness that was ravaging the men arriving from the plant. Quickly, the most severely affected personnel, including Dyatlov, were stabilized and transported by air to Moscow, to the specialized clinic number 6, a hospital reserved for the treatment of radiation sickness. This journey to Moscow marked a profound transition for Anatoly Dyatlov. He went from being the commanding authority at the epicenter of the world's worst nuclear disaster to being a patient struggling for his life. Isolated from the world as the Kremlin machine began its relentless work of constructing the official narrative. In the Soviet mindset, the disaster could not be the result of design flaws or systemic failures. It had to be criminal negligence. And Anatoly Dyatlov, the man who had ordered the continuation of the test and insisted on the risky operational conditions, was the natural and inevitable choice to carry the institutional burden of guilt. His immediate survival, ironically, meant he would have to face not only the medical consequences of his exposure, but the full, unforgiving weight of the Soviet legal apparatus. The fight for his life was now inextricably linked to a fight for his freedom, a battle that would define the rest of his existence. The seismic shock that ripped through reactor number 4 at 1:23 and 45 seconds on the 26th of April, 1986, instantaneously redefined the existence of every single person present in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. For Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer, the immediate sensory experience was one of utter, incomprehensible violence. It was not merely the sound of an explosion. It was the physical sensation of the very foundation of his professional life collapsing around him. When the dust began to settle, both literally and figuratively, Dyatlov's mind, battered by the concussive force and rapidly absorbing a lethal dose of radiation, entered a state of profound and dangerous denial. This denial was not a simple act of cowardice or an attempt to shift blame. It was an ingrained reflex born of deep professional certainty and the rigid dogma of Soviet nuclear engineering. The RBMK reactor, as designed and certified, was structurally incapable of suffering a core explosion of this magnitude. Therefore, based on his training and decades of experience, the catastrophe that had just occurred, could not have happened. The first and most critical error of the immediate aftermath was Dyatlov's assessment of the damage. Emerging from the control room of Block 4, place now choked with the smell of scorched metal, ozone, and graphite, Dusty was confronted by a scene of utter devastation. Yet, even as walls crumbled and systems screamed, Dyatlov remained convinced that the explosion was external. His theory, one he clung to with unyielding tenacity, was that the massive reserve water tank, located nearby, had ruptured violently. This, he reasoned, explained the force, the debris, and the widespread structural damage, while leaving the reactor core, the centerpiece of the system, guaranteed by countless Soviet assurances intact, albeit severely damaged. This faulty assessment dictated every command that followed, and these commands placed dozens of men directly into the path of destruction. Dyatlov was the ranking supervisory officer on the site at that hour, and despite the chaos, his authority remained absolute in the eyes of the junior operators. His orders were to take steps to stabilize the reactor, which, in his mind, meant two things: re-establishing coolant flow and attempting to insert the control rods. The sheer absurdity of these tasks, given the reality of the situation, is staggering. Leonid Topchinov and Alexander Akimov, the young operators who were already suffering severe radiation burns and struggling to breathe, were instructed to manually open the water valves in a desperate attempt to pump cooling water into a core that no longer existed as a unified structure. The cooling system's pipes were twisted wreckage, and the vast steam and pressure channels had been vaporized or ejected through the ruined roof. Pumping water now served only to spread highly radioactive debris further through the plant structure and into the sublevel areas, creating a radioactive slurry rather than providing meaningful cooling. Furthermore, Dyatlov insisted on verifying the status of the control rods. These rods, which were supposed to halt the fission chain reaction, had been ordered to drop moments before the catastrophe. Yet the seismic shock and subsequent steam blast had jammed or broken the drive mechanisms. Dyatlov commanded operators to try and manually lower the rods, forcing them to traverse hallways where radiation levels were already spiking into lethal zones, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of rentgens per hour, just to confirm the physical location of mechanisms that were now suspended over a literal, open inferno. His behavior in these first moments was characterized by an almost maniacal focus on the procedural fix, overriding the blatant physical evidence presented to him. When subordinates tried to report that parts of the reactor hall walls were gone, that they could see stars through the gaping hole where the roof used to be, or that the crucial Dorita tanks were destroyed, Dyatlov dismissed these observations, often with harsh rebukes. He accused them of panic, suggesting that the darkness and the smoke were misleading their perceptions. In his rigidly structured world, chaos meant a failure of command, and his primary duty was to restore order by following the emergency protocols for a conventional pipe break or pressure vessel rupture. Regardless of what his own senses or the dying reports of his team were telling him, the psychological impact of the disaster on Dyatlov was compounded by the swift onset of acute radiation syndrome. While his mind was grappling with the technical impossibility of the core explosion, his body was rapidly deteriorating. By the time he made his first brief tour of the facility to assess the damage journey that was itself a suicidal exposure, he was experiencing the telltale signs: a metallic taste in his mouth, intense nausea, and an overwhelming weakness. During this brief, horrific inspection, Dyatlov did venture onto the damaged floors. He saw the piles of debris and the widespread structural failure. Crucially, it is reported that he saw pieces of graphite lying around massive blocks that were integral to the RBMK core design. For any nuclear engineer, seeing graphite outside the containment structure was the ultimate, irrefutable sign that the core had been breached. Yet, even in the face of this damning physical evidence, Dyatlov's cognitive fortress held firm. He may have rationalized the graphite as coming from a storage area, or perhaps his rapidly failing memory and judgment simply refused to process the implication. He returned to the control room, still ordering water pumps to be kept running, still maintaining the illusion of a salvageable, intact reactor. This adherence to a false reality was the core tragedy of the initial response. Dyatlov's authoritarian structure, combined with the extreme danger, ensured that none of the increasingly bewildered and ill operators felt they had the capacity or the right to directly countermand their superior. His denial became the official policy of the control room for the first critical hour. When the plant director Viktor Bryakhanov and chief engineer Nikolai Fomin began to receive preliminary reports in the pre-dawn hours, the information funneling up to them was filtered directly through Dyatlov's distorted lens. Dyatlov, perhaps intentionally or simply due to his deeply rooted denial, significantly downplayed the severity of the incident. He reported a major accident, a fire, and significant structural damage consistent with his water tank rupture theory, but he omitted or minimized any details that suggested a complete core destruction. This initial transmission of false data was devastating because it determined the scale of the early response. Bryakhanov, relying on Dyatlov's technical expertise, believed the situation was manageable, requiring conventional firefighting and technical repairs. There was no immediate panic, no immediate mass evacuation order, because the man on the ground, the highest-ranking engineer present at the time of the explosion, insisted that the reactor, fundamentally, was still their asterisk. It wasn't until approximately 3 a.m., nearly 90 minutes after the explosion, when Dyatlov was forced to acknowledge the severity of his physical condition, constant vomiting an incapacitating weakness, that he began to relinquish direct control. Even then, he did not admit the core was destroyed. He simply recognized he could no longer function. He was transported to the plant medical unit, leaving behind a chaotic scene where operators were still, almost religiously, trying to execute his impossible orders. Dyatlov's subsequent transfer to Pripyat Hospital, and eventually to Moscow's Clinic No. 6, marked the end of his active role in the disaster response. But the legacy of his first hour of command was irreversible. His rigid adherence to failed protocol and his stubborn refusal to accept the truth of the RBMK's catastrophic design flaw ensured that vital time was lost. Radiation exposure was maximized for dozens of first responders, and the true nature of the disaster remained obscured from the upper echelons of the Soviet hierarchy just when transparency and decisive action were most needed. The man who had been obsessed with safety and procedural correctness became, in that single hour, the architect of a second layer of disaster built on denial and misplaced certainty. The ordeal that Anatoly Dyatlov faced in the immediate aftermath of the explosion was twofold: a physical battle against the insidious destruction wrought by massive doses of ionizing radiation, and a psychological war waged against a state machinery already determined to mold a narrative of human failure. When he was eventually evacuated from Pripyat and transported to Hospital No. 6 in Moscow, a specialized facility reserved for the Soviet Union's most sensitive radiation cases, he was a ghost of the robust engineer he had once been. His estimated radiation dose was staggeringly high, likely exceeding 500 rads in localized areas, sufficient to induce severe acute radiation syndrome, or ARS. Dyatlov's suffering in those early days was profound and undeniable. His body reacted violently to the cellular destruction, manifesting the classic symptoms of the syndrome: relentless vomiting, persistent diarrhea, and the slow, agonizing destruction of the bone marrow and mucosal linings. He experienced the terrifying phenomenon known as radiation burns, which were not mere surface injuries but deep lesions where radiation had decimated tissue down to the muscle and bone. His legs were particularly affected, swollen and ravaged to the point where, for a significant period, doctors feared he might lose them. He lay isolated, surrounded by the quiet suffering of dozens of his colleagues and subordinates, many of whom would not survive the first weeks. He was witnessing, firsthand, the human cost of the technical failure he was now being held responsible for. But even as his physical health hung by the thinnest of threads, the machinery of the State Investigation Commission was already worry into action, establishing the official party line. While Dyatlov was battling for his life, the KGB and high-level party officials were constructing the edifice of blame. Their primary objective was clear and non-negotiable: to localize the cause of the disaster to a specific sequence of human operational errors, thereby shielding the fundamental design flaws of the Soviet RBMK, Richter, Bolshoi, Moshkanosti, Kanani, or high-power channel-type reactor from international scrutiny. To admit that the RBMK reactor, the flagship of the Soviet nuclear power program, was inherently unsafe was unthinkable. It would have been an acknowledgement of systemic engineering failure at the highest echelons of Soviet science. This political necessity meant that Dyatlov, along with plant director Viktor Bryakhanov and chief engineer Nikolai Fomin, transitioned almost seamlessly from victims of industrial accident to prime criminal suspects. They were the perfect scapegoats, men who were present, who made decisions, and whose errors could be clearly delineated, regardless of whether those errors were based on faulty instructions or a dangerously unpredictable machine. As Dyatlov slowly began the painful process of recuperation, a process measured in millimeters of skin, regeneration, and agonizingly slow blood cell counts, the investigators began their work in earnest. Interrogations began while he was still medically vulnerable, confined to the sterile, almost oppressive environment of the Moscow hospital ward. These interviews were not merely investigative, they were prosecutorial from the outset. Investigators sought confirmation of procedural breaches, focusing intensely on the decision to continue the test despite the reactor's low power state and the overriding of specific safety protocols. Dyatlov's responses, however, were not the confessions of a broken man accepting guilt. Despite his physical debilitation and the immense psychological pressure, he maintained a resolute, often furious, defense rooted in technical reality. He argued that the operators, himself included, had followed the established, if dangerously flawed, internal regulations provided by the plant's design bureau. He stressed that the parameters he was operating under, while pushing the boundaries of safe operation, were not explicitly prohibited by the procedures he was trained to obey. This distinction between following written but flawed protocols versus inventing completely new, forbidden procedures would form the crux of his defense in the months to come. Crucially, Dyatlov began to articulate the deep, systemic flaw in the RBMK design that was, at the time of the explosion, a heavily guarded state secret: the positive void coefficient. This highly complex technical detail is fundamental to understanding the nature of the catastrophe and Dyatlov's culpability. In virtually all Western-designed nuclear reactors, increasing the presence of steam bubbles voids in the coolant water actually decreases the rate of nuclear fission, providing a negative feedback loop that naturally shuts the reactor down in an emergency. This is an inherent safety feature. The RBMK, tragically, operated on the inverse principle. Due to its unique design employing graphite moderation and light water cooling channels, an increase in steam bubbles actually increased the reactor's reactivity, leading to a runaway power surge, positive feedback loop. Dyatlov understood this physical phenomenon, but the true magnitude of this coefficient, the rate at which power would surge, was minimized or entirely omitted from the operating manuals provided to the plant staff. They were operating a machine whose inherent instability was hidden from them by the very engineers who designed it. When the operators initiated the rapid shutdown sequence, the emergency scram by inserting the control rods, they unknowingly triggered the most lethal element of the RBMK design. This was the infamous end effect. The control rods, used to absorb neutrons and halt the chain reaction, were tipped with graphite before the neutron-absorbing boron carbide section began. When the rods were inserted, these graphite tips temporarily displaced water at the bottom of the core, because graphite is a less effective neutron absorber than the water it replaced. This displacement caused a localized, momentary, but massive spike in reactivity right at the bottom of the core. This micro-event was sufficient, given the already volatile state of the reactor core due to the positive void coefficient, to initiate the catastrophic power excursion that ripped Unit 4 apart. Dyatlov argued vehemently that the operator's final action, the pressing of the AZ5 button, the emergency scram, was exactly what they were trained to do in an emergency. They did not intentionally sabotage the reactor. They attempted to save it using the only authorized safety mechanism available to them. That this safety mechanism was, in fact, a detonation trigger, was a design failure of staggering proportion, and one that Soviet officialdom was determined to lay at the feet of the men who pressed the button. As the months passed and Dyatlov's health stabilized sufficiently for him to be released from the hospital and placed under house arrest in Kyuhu, the weight of the investigation intensified. The atmosphere surrounding the pending trial in 1987 was not one of objective legal inquiry, but of carefully managed political theater. The prosecution was heavily influenced by the State Commission, which included prominent figures like academician Valery Legasov, who, despite recognizing the design flaws, had been pressured to prioritize human error in his public reports to the International Atomic Energy Agency (IAEA). Dyatlov was thus caught in a legal vice, squeezed between the undeniable fact that procedural rules were violated even if based on faulty premises, and the undeniable fact that the reactor itself was a ticking time bomb. The prosecution systematically built its case by emphasizing the operational violations, the failure to maintain a safe level of reactivity margin, the bypassing of the emergency core cooling system (ECCs) during the preparation for the test, and the continuation of operation at low power levels, all of which were documented deviations from the written rules. For Dyatlov, the fight became one of shifting the narrative focus from operational negligence to systemic, institutional deceit. His defense team, operating within the strict confines of a Soviet legal system heavily controlled by the Communist Party, struggled valiantly to introduce evidence regarding the RBMK's fatal design flaws. They attempted to highlight that the operators were never informed about the positive void coefficient, nor the lethal graphite tips on the control rods. These details, however, were routinely dismissed or minimized by the court, which operated under a clear mandate: assign guilt to the local personnel. The prosecution's approach was emotionally charged and focused on the undeniable consequence of the event: the deaths, the radiation sickness, the massive displacement, and the economic ruin. Dyatlov, as Deputy Chief Engineer for Operations, was held up as the representative of the technical command hierarchy who forced the test to continue against the warnings of his staff and the inherent instability of the reactor core. His prior reputation as a highly demanding, sometimes harsh supervisor, who had successfully run difficult nuclear tests before, was twisted into evidence of his reckless ambition and disregard for safety. The very intensity and focus he applied to his work attributes, once valued by the Soviet technical community, were now liabilities used to paint him as the primary villain. The psychological toll on Dyatlov was immense. He was a survivor among those who perished, acutely aware of the suffering of his team, yet unable to accept the official assignment of sole responsibility. He was facing the full force of a state desperate to cover up its engineering embarrassment. The narrative being built around him was monolithic: a tale of hubris, operational indiscipline, an ultimate betrayal of the socialist ideal of technological perfection. As the trial date loomed, the stage was set for a confrontation between a single, gravely ill engineer and the entire weight of the Soviet scientific and political establishment. A confrontation where the outcome seemed predetermined long before the first gavel fell. His fate, and the fate of the truth about the RBMK, hung precariously in the balance. The summer of 1987 brought with it a reckoning, staged not in the halls of the Kremlin or the scientific institutes of Moscow, but in the provincial setting of the House of Culture in Chernobyl town. This was more than just a judicial proceeding. It was political theater designed to satisfy a demanding and increasingly skeptical world, while simultaneously protecting the foundational structures of Soviet technological pride. Anatoly Dyatlov, along with the former plant director Viktor Bryakonov and the chief engineer Nikolai Fomin, stood accused, their physical deterioration a testament to the horror they had survived, their legal fate predetermined by the state narrative. The setting itself spoke volumes. Holding the trial in the shadow of the exclusion zone was intended to underscore the gravity of the calamity and the immediate responsibility of the operators on the ground. The air in the courtroom, thick with tension and the silent accusations of the survivors and victims' families, contrasted sharply with the arid, highly technical language of the prosecution. For Dyatlov, still struggling profoundly with the severe chronic effects of his radiation exposure, his digestive tract permanently damaged, his strength utterly depleted, the trial was a torturous ordeal, necessitating frequent medical attention just to remain seated through the proceedings. Yet, despite his weakness, his inherent stubbornness and technical precision remained sharp, fueling his defense. The core conflict of the trial revolved around a sophisticated bait-and-switch. The state prosecutor meticulously built a case focusing almost exclusively on operational negligence, the violation of safety protocols, the continuation of the test despite low power levels, and the supposed disregard for regulatory procedures. This narrative was clean, simple, and crucially, it placed the blame squarely on the men inside the control room, thereby diverting attention from the inherent and catastrophic design flaws of the RBMK reactor itself. Dyatlov, however, refused to be a passive scapegoat, even as he admitted to procedural errors' necessity. Given the rushed nature of the planned safety test and the pervasive culture of cutting corners to meet production, he fiercely maintained that the procedural errors committed were not the root cause of the explosion. He used every ounce of his technical knowledge and professional seniority to argue that the disaster was triggered by a systemic flaw, a fatal design defect inherent in the RBMK 1000. He pointed specifically to the positive void coefficient and the unforgivable flaw of the control rods. He testified, often with painstaking technical detail that confused the non-specialist courtroom audience, about the fatal characteristic of the graphite-tipped control rods. When the emergency shutdown button, the AZ5, was pressed in a low-power state, those tips temporarily displaced the water at the bottom of the core, creating a momentary, localized surge in reactivity. Instead of shutting the reactor down immediately, the insertion of the rods effectively gave the reactor a final, catastrophic spike of power, the very opposite of the intended safety mechanism. Dyatlov maintained that when he finally ordered the AZ5 pressed, believing it was the only remaining option to halt the runaway reaction, the operators were unwittingly triggering the final explosive chain reaction. This technical defense was inconvenient, unwelcome, and fundamentally subversive to the Soviet state. To admit the RBMK design was flawed was to admit that the entire Soviet nuclear program was predicated on a dangerous deception, and that the deaths were ultimately a bureaucratic, not an operational, failure. Therefore, Dyatlov's detailed testimony regarding the specific behavior of the reactor on the night of April 26, 1986, was often minimized, dismissed, or reframed by the prosecution as an attempt to evade personal responsibility through complex technical jargon. The judges, acting under the heavy hand of the party apparatus, were not interested in debating core physics or engineering ethics. They were interested in delivering a verdict that closed the case and provided political resolution. On July 29, 1987, Anatoly Dyatlov, along with Bryakhanov and Fomin, received the maximum sentence, 10 years in a labor camp for criminal negligence, leading to grave consequences. The sentence was harsh, not merely a punishment for the disaster, but a definitive governmental assertion that the Chernobyl catastrophe was the fault of local incompetence, not state design. The immediate aftermath of the sentencing plunged Dyatlov into the harsh reality of the Soviet corrective labor system, often simply referred to as the Gulag, although by the 1980s the camps had technically evolved into labor colonies. Dyatlov was transferred to Correctional Facility 35, an institution known for its harsh conditions. For a man already terminally ill from high doses of radiation exposure, this sentence was effectively a death warrant by attrition. The physical strain of imprisonment, coupled with the cumulative damage inflicted by the ionizing radiation, accelerated his decay. He suffered from severe gastrointestinal issues, constant fatigue, and the ongoing suppression of his immune system. The medical care available in the correctional facility was rudimentary and entirely insufficient to manage the complex, systemic failure of an acute radiation syndrome victim. His body, already in a desperate struggle to regenerate damaged cells, was subjected to a diet lacking essential nutrients and a relentless schedule of labor designed to break the spirit. Dyatlov described the environment in the prison as cruel, not primarily due to specific physical torture, but due to the systematic neglect and the indifference to human suffering. Every day was a battle against his own failing biology. The radiation had made him an anomaly, a walking medical crisis that the prison system was ill-equipped and unwilling to handle with proper dignity or specialized care. His existence became a stark, painful illustration of the human cost the Soviet state was willing to bury to protect its image, while Dyatlov languished in the labor camp, enduring the freezing Ukrainian winters and the relentless battle against his failing health. The global narrative concerning Chernobyl slowly began to shift. The initial, monolithic Soviet account of operator error, so convincingly presented during the trial, started to erode under the scrutiny of Western scientists and, crucially, under the internal policy shifts initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev's push for *glasnost*, or openness. The scientific community, particularly the sympathetic physicists within the Soviet Union who knew the full truth of the RBMK flaws, began to cautiously challenge the official findings. Reports presented to the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, initially upheld the operator error model, but subsequent revisions and confidential reports began to acknowledge the structural deficiencies that Dyatlov had risked everything to articulate in the courtroom. It became increasingly clear that the disaster required the convergence of both operational mistakes, lethal design, flaws, a truth that fundamentally undermined the justification for Dyatlov's severe sentence. International pressure, driven by human rights organizations and the growing awareness of Dyatlov's terminal health status, also played a significant role. The sight of a dying man, scapegoated for a disaster that was increasingly recognized as an institutional failure, began to create a public relations liability for the Soviet Union, even as the regime desperately clung to its internal narrative of accountability. His wife, tireless in her efforts, petitioned endlessly for his release on medical grounds. The simple fact was that Dyatlov was not expected to survive his full sentence. His continued imprisonment risked turning a convenient scapegoat into an international martyr. The logic of political damage control slowly began to outweigh the initial need for symbolic punishment. The medical reality was undeniable. If Dyatlov died in prison, it would provide undeniable evidence of the system's ruthlessness and indifference. The confluence of Dyatlov's rapidly deteriorating health, the emerging international understanding of the RBMK's critical flaws, and the broader atmosphere of *glasnost* finally opened a narrow window for his deliverance. He had served only 4 years of his 10-year sentence, but those years had extracted a devastating toll. The legal and political apparatus of the Soviet Union had successfully used him as a shield against accountability. But that shield was now fracturing under the weight of truth and impending mortality. The struggle for his life was mirroring the struggle for the accurate. historical understanding of the Chernobyl disaster itself. Dyatlov represented not merely an operator who made mistakes, but a victim of an unforgiving, technologically arrogant system that refused to prioritize safety over political expediency and production quotas. His release, when it finally occurred, would be less an act of clemency and more a pragmatic political decision to minimize further embarrassment. Yet it would mark the beginning of his final campaign to set the record straight about the disaster he had survived. If you are finding this exploration of history compelling, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps us continue to delve into the most crucial and complex stories of the past. The story of Anatoly Dyatlov, the man who oversaw the fatal test on the night of April 26, 1986, does not conclude with his imprisonment. It merely transitions into a new, complex chapter defined by relentless illness, persistent defense, and a furious battle for the historical record. Dyatlov, convicted as a key perpetrator and sentenced to 10 years for criminal mismanagement, ultimately served less than 4. His release in 1990, facilitated by a combination of humanitarian concerns, international pressure, and the catastrophic deterioration of his health, marked the beginning of his final campaign, rewriting his own role in history. Dyatlov was released primarily because the radiation exposure he suffered on the night of the disaster was slowly killing him. Having received an estimated 550 rem, or 5.5 sieverts, an undeniably lethal dose of acute radiation poisoning, his body was in a permanent state of crisis. The initial, immediate effects of acute radiation syndrome had been addressed by the intensive, groundbreaking treatments at Moscow's Hospital No. 6, but the long-term, systemic damage was irreversible. Upon his release, he was not a free man in the typical sense. He was a patient on permanent parole, tethered to the Soviet, and later Ukrainian, medical system. His bone marrow had stabilized only through immense effort, his gastrointestinal tract was permanently scarred, and most critically, his heart, kidneys, and circulatory system were compromised by the constant stress and cellular decay induced by the penetrating gamma and neutron radiation. Life after the Gulag was centered on survival. He relocated to Kyiv, the capital of Soviet Ukraine, where he received constant medical care. The early 1990s were a period of immense political upheaval, with the Soviet Union fracturing and Ukraine declaring independence. This backdrop of national chaos ironically provided Dyatlov with a degree of anonymity and, more importantly, a platform. While the Soviet establishment was crumbling, its iron grip on historical narrative weakened, allowing dissenting voices, especially those like Dyatlov, who carried the physical scars of the event, to finally speak. Dyatlov never recanted his defense. From the moment of his trial in 1987 until his death, he remained unyielding in his belief that while operator errors were certainly committed, specifically the rapid increase in power prior to the shutdown, these errors were only catastrophic because of the fundamentally flawed design of the RBMK reactor. This was not a plea for simple self-justification. It was a deeply technical argument rooted in his 30 years of experience with nuclear propulsion and reactor operations. He believed he was the victim of a system that prioritized cheap construction and secrecy over safety and transparency. His primary target of blame was the positive void coefficient inherent in the RBMK design and, crucially, the design flaw of the control rods themselves. Dyatlov understood and argued passionately that the design of the graphite-tipped control rods created a temporary but extremely dangerous power surge during the initial seconds of their insertion, the very moment the operators were attempting to initiate the emergency shutdown, known as AZ-5. This power surge, lasting only seconds but immensely powerful, was what drove the reactor beyond critical and led to the catastrophic steam explosion. This technical argument was complex, but it was central to exonerating the operators from the final, fatal chain reaction. Shifting the focus back onto the engineers and regulatory bodies that had signed off on the inherently unstable reactor design, he dedicated his remaining, frail years to documenting this argument, culminating in his memoir, published in English under the title Chernobyl, How It Happened. This book was not written for sensationalism. It was a dry, technical rebuttal to the official Soviet narrative, which had consistently placed 90% of the blame solely on the operators for alleged gross violations of operating regulations. Dyatlov aimed to dismantle that 90% figure entirely. The memoir served a vital historical purpose, especially in the West. It provided a boots-on-the-ground perspective that was highly critical of the Soviet system and its engineering failures. Before Dyatlov's account, the primary international reports, largely influenced by the initial Soviet submissions to the International Atomic Energy Agency (IAEA) in Vienna, had painted a picture of reckless, incompetent staff, essentially ignoring the critical RBMK design flaws. Dyatlov's book, alongside the later revelations from academic and scientific investigations, helped swing the pendulum back. He meticulously detailed the procedural context, the limitations of the available instrumentation, and the insidious way in which Soviet safety culture mandated silence about known reactor instabilities. He detailed how the critical RBMK operational manual had explicitly forbidden operation at low power, rule the operators were violating, but also explained that the test they were conducting was *necessary*, and *approved* to address a known operational safety gap concerning the turbine rundown. More importantly, he underlined that the operators had no way of knowing about the fatal power spike caused by the control rods because that information had been actively classified and withheld from the operating staff. How could one be criminally negligent for a design flaw that was deliberately hidden from the very people running the machinery? This was the core of Dyatlov's defense and the central thesis of his literary work. The publication of his book, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, found a receptive audience among international nuclear safety experts, while virtually no one fully absolved Dyatlov of all fault he had. After all, displayed aggressive managerial style and had pressed the test forward against certain indicators of instability, the consensus began to shift significantly. Experts acknowledged that the ultimate catastrophe was indeed pre-programmed into the RBMK design. Dyatlov's relentless advocacy ensured that the RBMK's positive void coefficient and the control rod defect would never again be sidelined in historical analysis. However, the pursuit of historical truth took a relentless toll on his already ravaged physical form. His final years in Kyiv were characterized by frequent hospitalizations. Radiation damage is insidious. It doesn't heal fully. It sets the stage for cascading organ failure and cancer. Dyatlov was suffering from radiation-induced cardiovascular disease, a common sequela of high-dose exposure. The tiny, persistent damage to the endothelial lining of his blood vessels and the accelerated calcification of his arteries strained his heart relentlessly. He also struggled with radiation cataracts, which impaired his vision, a painful reminder of the flash of blue ionization light he witnessed that terrible night. His family, including his wife, continued to support him fiercely. They recognized the injustice of his unique position, a man held solely responsible for a failure that was structurally predetermined by a secretive, flawed state apparatus. Despite his physical suffering, Dyatlov reportedly maintained a sharp mind, dedicating hours to correspondence, interviews, and detailed technical discussions, always ready to argue the fine points of physics and reactor kinetics. He saw himself as fighting for the memory of the men who died under his command, arguing that their fatal mistakes were induced by the systemic deceit of the Soviet state. Anatoly Dyatlov's journey reached its inevitable, tragic conclusion on December 13, 1995, 9 years after the disaster he helped unleash. He died in Kyiv at the age of 64, from heart failure directly attributable to the radiation exposure he sustained at the Chernobyl plant. His death was not instantaneous like those who perished in the immediate explosion, nor was it rapid like the firemen and engineers who died weeks later from overwhelming RS. His death was a slow, decade-long attrition. Chernobyl claimed him through protracted suffering, turning his remaining life into a testament to the disaster's long reach. The death of Anatoly Dyatlov served as a final marker for the initial judicial fallout of Chernobyl. He was the last major figure from the initial group of convicted personnel to die, and his passing coincided with a period of renewed international scrutiny of the disaster. By the mid-1990s, the understanding of what happened at Unit 4 had matured far beyond the narrow focus on operator error that dominated the initial Soviet narrative. Dyatlov's complex legacy endures because history ultimately vindicated his core technical claim. In 1993, the International Atomic Energy Agency issued a revised report that acknowledged the significant role of the RBMK reactor design flaws, effectively mitigating the 90% operator fault figure previously championed by the Soviets. This shift was monumental. It confirmed that while Dyatlov and his team displayed arrogance and violated procedural guidelines, their actions would not have resulted in a total core breach had they been operating a Western-style, inherently stable light water reactor. Dyatlov remains a controversial figure. He was unquestionably an authoritarian manager whose impatience and disregard for established safety margins contributed to the dangerous conditions leading up to the test. However, he also became the unwilling and painful repository of the Soviet Union's institutional failures. He was a symbol of the Soviet system's tendency to blame individuals rather than admit systemic engineering defects. His memoir, and the subsequent international acceptance of its central argument, transformed him from a simple villain into a complex, flawed, yet crucial witness to the truth. In the final accounting of the Chernobyl disaster, Anatoly Dyatlov is the man who oversaw the test, survived the blast, endured the prison sentence, and then spent his remaining life demanding that the historical record reflect the technical culpability of the reactor itself. His life was defined by the event, and his death was a direct, delayed consequence of it. He left behind a technical document that fundamentally shaped the global understanding of the disaster, forcing the world to recognize that Chernobyl was not merely a story of human error, but a devastating collision of arrogance, secrecy, and fatal engineering design. The RBMK reactors that continued to operate after 1986 were all retrofitted with modifications that Dyatlov himself had argued were necessary, a silent acknowledgement from the scientific community that the scapegoat had, in fact, been telling a profound technical truth all along. The tale of Dyatlov is a chilling reminder that the consequences of such historical catastrophes are often drawn out over decades, punishing the guilty, the innocent, and the institutionally compromised with equal, radioactive finality. He lived long enough to ensure his version of events was heard, cementing his place not just as an operator in the control room that night, but as the relentless advocate for the RBMK's deadly design secrets. He is buried in Kyiv, one of the countless victims of the atomic age. His life, a cautionary footnote on the devastating cost of state secrecy and flawed engineering. Thank you for joining us on this deep exploration of one of history's most critical events. If you found this analysis insightful and want to continue exploring the complex narratives hidden within history, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support is vital for us to keep investigating the untold stories of Chernobyl and beyond.